I want to do an interview with Dr. Stephen Anton, so I definitely went ahead and contacted him and his team, and hopefully we can get an interview for this channel. That will be fantastic. He is a doctor in the specific diseases of obesity and chronic illness, so it isn't like a doctor about something else talking about intermittent fasting. It's a doctor who's focusing on these elements in human beings. Hey, what's going on, IF Warriors? It's your boy, Edward V. And now I have here Dr. Stephen Anton. And as I said, I was going to try to reach out to him, and he was gracious enough to reply to my email. And we finally have this interview set up that I'm super excited for. Just keep in mind, Dr. Stephen Anton, you are my first interviewee I've ever had. So I apologize if it isn't as structured as it can be. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Stephen Anton for you guys before I go ahead and do this interview, so you guys get an idea of where he's coming from. Dr. Stephen Anton has a PhD from the University of Florida. He has worked with the University of Florida within the Department of Aging and Geriatric Research, as well as the Department of Clinical and Health Psychology. He was selected to become the Chief of Clinical Research Division within the Department of Aging and Geriatric Research. He also was selected as a term professor in 2017. And he has obtained and conducted multiple grants examining the effects that lifestyle-based interventions have on functions involving obesity, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic diseases related to aging. So those are really good accolades for someone who is going to talk about things involving health, obviously. I have a few questions, and the questions that I have for you are questions that a lot of my audience are consistently asking me. And I feel like these answers coming from you give it your perspective, which I feel is very important. Perspective of someone who is consistently in the trenches doing the medical research that you're doing. Do you have anything that you want to add?
No, not at this point. That's good.
Okay.
I'm ready to hear your questions.
All right, good. Okay, so first question I want to ask is, what's the best advice that you have for someone who is starting intermittent fasting for the first time?
It's a good one, and that's a key question that a lot of people want to know, like, how do you actually do it? And probably my best advice would be to start slow. Don't feel like you have to go the full marathon, whatever that means to you. It could mean 16 hours, which a lot of people, talk about when we talk about time restricted feeding of the 16-hour, 8 hours of eating, 16 hours of fasting. A lot of people when they start think, oh, I need to do the whole 16 hours, but I try to liken it to running a marathon. You wouldn't just go run a marathon without training. So my best advice would be to, see if you can prolong that first meal by maybe 20, 30 minutes, see how you feel, and then maybe the next day do it a little bit longer, and gradually allow your body to adapt to fasting rather than feeling like you have to start the full 16 hours if we're talking about time restricted feeding. And same thing would apply to the other common approach to intermittent fasting, the alternate day feeding fasting cycle.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of people have a lot of fear when it comes to fasting, especially because they're so used to the breakfast, lunch, and dinner model. Usually what I say is I always feel like the 16-8 is a decent entry level structure because it's not as crazy as the 20-hour fasting or the 1 meal a day fasting. But skipping breakfast is an easy route to go for some people. Some people skip breakfast just naturally because they have to go to work or because they're in a rush. So I feel like if they put those two and two in their minds, maybe they lose a little bit of the fear that, they understand that, hey, sometimes I skip breakfast and that's kind of equivalent to a 16-8 fast. So, but definitely.
Just, in my experience, I've encountered a lot of different perspectives and people telling me, oh, I could never skip breakfast, or
Mm-hmm.
it's so easy to skip breakfast. So it's such a mixed bag in what I've experienced. Personally, I never used to skip breakfast for the longest time. We can talk about my life, but as over time, as I've adapted, it's become just natural for me. But it wasn't initially natural. So I always have compassion when people say, or empathy, so to speak, when they say it's not easy to skip breakfast. I get it. Yeah. What else to say about that? I also think it's really important to make sure you're hydrating. That can help with hunger, to consume water. And personally, coffee helps me a lot too, as I that transition period. So I agree with you that there are more levels besides the 16-8, but at least as a starting point, I wouldn't even try to go for more than for the 16-hour fast.
Gotcha. Yeah. Makes perfect sense. And water, I think, is super important. A lot of people negate the water when fasting for some odd reason, but I feel like being hydrated is important. And if you're not eating throughout the day, eating is actually part of your hydration. And if you're eliminating that and also eliminating water, you will definitely become, dehydrated. Effects. Yeah, headaches and stuff like that can occur, I feel.
Exactly. It's possible. And just related to, I also tell people when they're wanting to start this, if they start to feel headachy or dizzy or lightheaded, why continue? It's not that day, give your body the break, because your body's signaling to you that this is a little too much right now. But if you're feeling good, that's a sign that I use for myself. I'm feeling good, focused, energized, not hungry. That's when you know you're kind of in a good place. And so you can use your body as a signal as well to guide you.
So for this question, I want to know what made you take notice of intermittent fasting, and then or actually you can start with when did you take notice, and then what made you say, oh, this is something interesting that I should look further into.
Yeah. When exactly is a good question. I had always been interested in health and diet and exercise and what the best combination is. And for me personally, and then for others to tell the world about. So being interested in weight loss and weight management and calorie restriction was kind of the paradigm, the approach that was most commonly used and still is the main approach. And so I did a lot of studies related to implementing calorie restriction for overweight individuals, and found that yes, it's an effective approach for losing weight, but it comes with a cost, and the cost is loss of fat-free mass in addition to fat mass when you're losing weight. And then this thing called metabolic adaptation, which means your metabolic rate actually decreases more than you would expect for the loss of fat-free mass. And then coupled with the fact that the majority of people, the vast majority of people, cannot or do not like to adhere to a calorie restriction regimen over the long term. Those types of things got me thinking about, well, are there alternative approaches that maybe could produce beneficial changes in body composition or produce fat loss without the loss of fat-free mass? And would the approach of intermittent fasting create this effect? There's so many different things that led me to start thinking about this. When I was at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, we did a trial of every other day fasting for 30 days. And at that time, I actually became less excited by the approach to intermittent fasting, because I don't think it was really a sustainable approach that study took. And in that study, individuals fasted for 24 hours and would actually start the eating period at midnight. So what happened was a lot of people would fast and just wait until midnight to then just consume large amounts of food. And I thought to myself, this can't be a healthy way to live. But so that was my first experience with it. This was about, 15 years ago. And I thought, well, maybe this isn't the optimal approach. Maybe there's another approach. But then over time, working at the Aging Institute and seeing findings from preclinical models showing that animals who engage in an intermittent fasting lifestyle actually are healthier, live longer, and have better endurance, etc., started me rethinking about, well, maybe this is an approach that can be used in humans. And that was what led to me conducting this review about 3 years ago. It started 3 years ago. I'll stop there if you have a question.
No, that's fine. It was actually pretty interesting. I don't mind if you continued, but yeah, that's so. Initially, you tried some sort of setup for intermittent fasting to see, or some type of trial to see if it would work, and then the adherence was what was concerning you, right? I feel that maybe there wasn't a lot of patients who wanted to do this diet long term.
Well, the approach that for the initial trial that I was a part of as an investigator that was used was not this design I would have chosen, but it was the design the principal investigator chose. And that was 24 hours of fasting followed by 24 hours of feasting. But the time frame in which the fasting occurred was from midnight one day to midnight the next day, which meant the feeding period started at midnight. And I just saw that, you know, a lot of the individuals in the study would tell me how challenging it was, and that they would end up just eating large quantities of food at midnight. So that approach, I thought, was probably not the optimal approach to helping people come up with a sustainable, healthy lifestyle that would involve fasting. And so I actually didn't pursue intermittent fasting for a little while, probably like 5 to 7 years, and continued to pursue, you know, different calorie restriction approaches, and then just again coming up with the frustration of those 3 factors: loss of fat-free mass, metabolic adaptation, and poor long-term adherence, led me to rethink again, well, what does the literature really say about these intermittent fasting programs, and what can we learn? And so in about 2015, I had the idea to do a review of the literature on clinical trials that have tested that have really looked at changes in body composition using DEXA machine, and to quantify what happens when people engage in either time-restricted feeding, which is the 16-8 type of fasting approach that's most commonly talked about, or every other day fasting, from clinical trials. And so we did this review. It actually took over a good year to synthesize the literature and to put together the review article that was published in 2017 on understanding the metabolic effects of intermittent fasting and the different approaches. And as you know, I partnered with Mark Mattson, who is at a National Institute on Aging, who's done a ton of work in this area.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I was going to ask you, does drinking coffee disrupt anything in the fast? But I feel that maybe considering the fact that you probably feel that is not the case. But it does. Coffee has very low calories. So in terms of coffee actually moving your insulin, I definitely do think that there might not be anything there with coffee. But is there anything that you might feel that
say about coffee and fasting? I think personally, I think it's a friend to individuals while they're fasting for a couple reasons. I think there's an effect on appetite regulation, and that effect may be because caffeine has been shown to increase production of ketones, and ketones are what occur when you engage the metabolic switch. And ketones is a source of energy. So the caffeine in coffee can have that effect, in addition to providing the energy through caffeine. And then coffee itself has something called chlorogenic acids, which help mobilize fat within the body as well. And so I think that combination is particularly helpful. Doesn't mean you need to drink coffee if you're not a coffee drinker. I just don't think it's harmful. Now, maybe it's harmful if you add sugar and cream to the coffee and it becomes more like ice cream. But but I don't think coffee itself has any detriment during the fast. And if you wanted a little cream in there, I don't think it's something that I would be too concerned about either. I actually, not usually my second or third cup, I'm add a little cream to it. If you know, I don't personally think it adds anything under 30 to 50 calories would disrupt the fasting process, but
interesting.
I don't have a study to support that. That's just
Gotcha.
what I understand. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's perfect. So another question that I have, and you being a doctor with a PhD and everything like that, I wanted to know maybe what the mindset is for a lot of other doctors, because I've noticed that there's a lot of pushback that comes with intermittent fasting. Some doctors are for it, but it's a very small group. You, Dr. Mark Mattson, Dr. Jason Fung, a lot of the doctors that are for intermittent fasting or feel that there is benefits that come from it are very few and far between. So I feel that the question that I have for you is, why do nearly all doctors recommend not to fast? And this is the recommendation that almost everyone comes to me and tells me my doctor will never recommend me to fast, and to eat the standard breakfast, lunch, and dinner meal model.
Yeah. This is a tough question, and not easy, not easy to say why many doctors don't. I think over the last couple of years, intermittent fasting has become a more accepted paradigm as an approach, and the health benefits of it are becoming more and more popular. And so I think that there is a shift happening where I think there's going to be much more acceptance of this type of approach to eating than there has been in the past. Now, why in the past, or why maybe many individuals currently wouldn't advocate for that, is a tough question to officially answer. But I believe there's epidemiological studies that suggest that individuals who skip breakfast have a higher body weight. Now, there's a lot of factors out there that could be responsible for that. And it's likely that if you skip a meal, and maybe the concern is if you're skipping a meal, you're going to have excessively high levels of hunger, and then you're going to be more likely to eat unhealthy foods later on because your body is screaming at you. That may be one reason why they would not advocate this approach. And again, that comes back to your first question: how do you actually do it? If somebody tries to go from not ever fasting to a long-term fast, they may feel lightheaded, dizzy, all those factors that you wouldn't want somebody to feel. So it's possible that those are the reasons that many of the medical doctors would not advocate for it. The other is, the potential glucose insulin regulation, which relates to the hunger and wanting to make sure an individual's glucose doesn't drop too low, and then they have hypoglycemia. I mean, it's probably coming from a very good place. It's just, I think as we learn more and more about the health benefits of intermittent fasting, it will become more accepted. And as people learn how to do this in a way that's healthy and sustainable.
Yeah, I feel like there's certain things that it's grouped together. All the doctors decide, or not decide, but they've gone a certain route, and it's the safest thing to tell someone to do, because of course intermittent fasting has emerging research, but they still want to go with models that have existed for a while to be just to. I feel that they're doing it in the interest of the patient, as you said, not to keep them away from anything, like, hey, this is a secret that we don't want you to succeed or whatever. I think it's no way, shape, or form is that, but I think it's just that they're going with the safer model by telling them to do those specific breakfast, lunch, dinner, and refrain from fasting.
I think so.
But interestingly enough, they always ask for you to fast before a lot of blood work and all these different things. So that
is true. That is an interesting observation as well.
Yeah.
Because the recognition is that when you eat, it changes all these factors.
Exactly.
So that is a good point.
So another question I have is, all things being equal, can intermittent fasting burn more fat in the long term based on biomarkers versus caloric restriction? If so, does this disrupt any laws of thermodynamics, or do you have any studies or anything that come close to giving you that answer or anything to that effect?
Good question. Now, a key word you said was in the long term.
In the long term.
I'll qualify my answer is we don't, unfortunately, at this point in time, have, by long term, I think of 1 year or longer studies. And from my knowledge, we don't have a 1 year or longer intermittent fasting clinical trial that is directly compared to caloric restriction, in which individuals actually adhered the way you'd want individuals to adhere. So having said that, based on the studies I reviewed in our article, what we showed was, fat loss occurs without significant loss of fat-free mass following the time-restricted feeding patterns in 5 clinical trials. And that to me was really interesting because, again, the loss of fat-free mass is one of the major drawbacks of calorie restriction. So if there's a method that can help your body maintain the fat-free mass, which is the primary driver of your metabolic rate, fat utilization, fat mobilization, that would have the potential to lead to longer term fat loss, as the goal would be when anybody enters a weight loss program. There are preclinical trials that were just published in just maybe 6 months ago by Lee that showed animals who engaged in every other day dieting or fasting, and then followed by eating a similar amount of calories as when they ate ad libitum, or as much as they wanted, actually had increased energy expenditure on the days in which they ate relative to those animals who ate all the time every day, and nice. Much greater increase in energy expenditure, and that increase was predominantly from utilizing fat for energy while they were eating. So it was very interesting that their caloric intake was pretty much the same as those who ate all the time, but their body weight was much lower, and it appeared that this was due to an increased energy expenditure on the days in which they were eating. So their body was, mobilizing fat to a greater extent, it appeared from this preclinical trial. So from what I can tell, the data are promising. About your question, does it have the potential to lead to more fat loss? I think yes. I think yes, it has the potential, but until we have the trials, we can't say with significant confidence that it does.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. So what about links to anti-aging in relations to intermittent fasting? What are the links that you see there that intermittent fasting provides in a positive aspect to anti-aging?
I think there's just many links. I think biologically speaking, it activates many of the same pathways, if not all of the same pathways as calorie restriction, which we know has been shown to extend a healthy lifespan in a wide variety of species. Things such as mitochondrial biogenesis, glucose insulin regulation, the cellular repair process, or the cellular waste removal process of autophagy, which has been shown to be linked with aging, very much so, that a Nobel Prize was awarded to it for the discovery of autophagy in 2016. And fasting, you know about that. Fasting seems to be one of the best ways to activate autophagy, as well as exercising. And so, at the cellular level, it's activating all these beneficial processes. At the metabolic level, it's, reducing demand on the system so that our insulin sensitivity is improved, our glucose regulation is improved, blood pressure is improved, heart rate is lowered. So all these, at a systemic level, it's reducing the burden. So I think that one would expect that combination would lead to a healthier individual and potentially a healthier lifespan. And indeed, trials from that trial I mentioned just a few minutes ago, where the animals ate every other day. No, it wasn't actually that trial. It was a different trial that they did eat every other day, but in that trial, the calories were again about the same in terms of compared to ad libitum, but those animals' life extension was, I think, 11% greater, even though they consume the same amount of calories basically as animals who were fed ad libitum. And so that suggests there's a mechanism that's independent of calorie intake that leads to extension of healthy lifespan. So that's pretty fascinating to me.
That is very, very fascinating. Can intermittent fasting, if done every day, lower your metabolic rate? Just intermittent fasting on its own, not in relations to calories. So if someone was to be able to consume the amount of calories needed per day with utilizing intermittent fasting, for example, the 16-8 method, would there be an effect on their metabolic rate? This is a big question that has been asked, and even between me and another personality on YouTube, in terms of the discussion of that. And I don't want to give you any bias, so I'm not going to tell you what my thoughts are on that, but I just want to know what you feel is would be happening if anything is happening.
So when you say intermittent fasting, you qualified it as 16-8 method. So that, just to be very clear, that we're talking about the 16-8 time restricted feeding method.
Yeah.
Would that affect metabolic rate? From what I can tell, again, referencing this 5 clinical trials where individuals engaged in the time restricted feeding 16-8, the weight that was lost was the fat loss, and the weight that was not lost was the fat-free mass loss. The reason why that's so important in relation to your question is because fat-free mass is the fundamental driver of metabolic rate. So if that's the case, then I would not expect there to be a detriment or a decline in metabolic rate as a result of engaging in the time-restricted feeding process, which would mean that potentially it would be easier to maintain any weight loss that would have occurred from the intermittent fasting type of lifestyle versus, again, the calorie-restricted type of lifestyle.
Okay, so all things considered, if you were to, if you felt good by doing the 16-8 method and it didn't affect you mentally, physically, and you felt comfortable, would it be a better, based on what you know, would it be better to do it every day or to do it just sparingly or every 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, in relations to that metabolic function or the metabolic rate that you're referring to?
So I think we want to separate physiologically and psychologically. And first, as you know, I'm a big proponent of what's sustainable, because if it's not sustainable, why are we doing this? Because it's only going to lead to a rebound effect.
Exactly.
So, is it something that would be ideal to do every day? I think physiologically, yes.
Okay.
Is it something that you have to do every day? I don't think that you have to do it every day in order to achieve many of the benefits. And if somebody wants on the weekend to just say, hey, I'm going to eat breakfast, let's just say before 12 or earlier, and that fits their lifestyle and their family, and they want to have family time, I would never tell somebody not to do that, because if 5 days a week they're able to, achieve a time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting lifestyle, and 2 days a week they don't, are they going to get a lot of benefits? I think so. I think that the benefits are there, and I liken it to exercise. Maybe it would be ideal to exercise every day. Does everybody exercise every day? Probably not.
No.
But do 5 days a week, is that pretty darn good? I think yes. So that's my answer. That, of course, and do I think it's something you can do every day? Yes, I do. And I think it's healthy to do every day. I just think we also want to recognize what's sustainable for each person, and for everybody it's a little different. So again, when you're starting, maybe you do it 3 days a week, and then you experiment a little bit, and maybe then you move to 4 and go from there.
So basically that's how I feel about that as well. And just to clear everything up for my audience, if someone was to do it every day and they want to do it every day, it would not, based on what you know so far in terms of the data, it would not affect their metabolic rate. it negatively?
From what I can tell, there would be no negative effect, presuming that when they do eat, they eat sufficient calories to maintain their fat-free mass.
Correct.
So that's the only caveat to throw in there. That
Yeah.
if you engage in time-restricted feeding and then don't eat many calories while you're actually eating, you will lose weight and likely at some point lose fat-free mass, because you still need to consume enough calories to meet your body's needs. And for everybody, that amount is going to be a little bit different depending on your resting metabolic rate and your physical activity levels. And some days it may be different. If you, for example, engage in a heavy weight training session, maybe that day you need a little bit more calories to make up for the increased metabolic activity.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
I think that's going to clear up a lot of, because there was a lot of confusion in terms of that, but I wanted to have someone with your credentials create or state an answer for it. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
What's more important, caloric restriction or your body's hormonal responses, or the hormonal actions that happen within your body? Does hormone carry more weight, or do they work together, or is caloric restriction the only thing one should look at? Of course, with healthy eating or those kind of things, but hormonal versus caloric restriction, basically, like what should one look at when trying to determine where they should go or what they should focus on in terms of their health and body weight, fat mass, and those kind of things?
So I'm trying to understand that question a little bit better.
Okay.
The hormone, when you say hormonal, do you mean looking at like glucose insulin regulation, or?
Yeah, just the total kind of hormonal responses that happen, ghrelin, cortisol, insulin.
Yeah, and there's many hormones that we all have.
Exactly.
Being activated, they're under circadian rhythm control a little bit.
Correct.
Related to our diet and physical activity levels. I mean, so it's, from my standpoint, what's most important is how you're feeling, and then if you're feeling good, that's usually a good sign of what's going on internally as being positive. Now, your question about calorie restriction, as you probably gathered from what I was saying, I think that can lead to health benefits, and we know it does. It's just it also comes with some challenges in terms of the loss of fat-free mass affecting metabolic rate long term. And so for somebody who wants to maintain their lean tissue, it's not the approach I would recommend, even though for other people, maybe it's an approach that works. So it's not that one's, quote, more important than the other. It's more a matter of what approach leads you to feel your best and also creates an internally healthy state is pretty much the goal.
Yeah. So for that and this is an interesting thing, and I'm actually there's questions that I've set up. I'm actually done with the questions that I've set up. But interestingly enough, you said it multiple times in this interview that the fat-free mass is affected. It shows to be affected more negatively with the caloric restriction over the intermittent fasting or the fasting. What do you think is causing that, though? Like, that's what I want to kind of understand.
Why is it the case?
Why is that?
That's a really good question. And some evidence is out there that ketone production, which occurs when you shift from using glucose for energy to using ketones for energy while you're fasting, there's some evidence out there that ketones are fat-free mass preserving. So they, instead of pulling the glucose, deriving glucose from muscle energy, which can occur when you're at a calorie deficit, you're deriving energy from your fat stores, and that energy is used in the form of ketones. And so you're not using your fat-free mass as a source of energy, which can occur when you're in a calorie deficit and you haven't shifted from the glucose to ketones as a source of energy. I hope that makes sense.
Gotcha. No, I completely understand. You're in a deficit, but you're also not allowing your body to utilize ketones, and the ketone bodies or the ketones in your body is what's creating that system that can be protecting muscle.
Exactly, because your source of energy is your own body fat, and that own body fat is producing ketones. So you're not using your lean tissue as ultimately a source of energy when you shifted, metabolically speaking, from glucose to ketones.
Now, is there a timing where you've gone over the fasting period where your body has no choice but to start to grab onto muscle tissue? Is there like a time limit, like maybe 48 hours or 72 hours or 5 days or whatever it is? If you're fasting, can you fast for too long to the point where?
There definitely is a time. What exactly that time frame is, it's going to vary from individual to individual. And I don't have the perfect answer to tell you when that time is.
But you acknowledge that there is a time.
And coming back to the review that we published in 2017, where we looked at both time-restricted feeding and alternate day fasting. In that case, when we looked at the changes in body composition in the 10 clinical trials in which alternate day fasting was the method used, there was, I think in at least 4 of them, a significant loss of fat-free mass that occurred from that type of approach, suggesting to me that at some point, for most people, you do start to shift a little bit, and maybe utilization of ketones is hard to sustain for 48 hours as the only source of energy. I'm not 100% sure, but I do know that in general, the reason why you don't see as much fat-free mass loss with intermittent fasting is because of the utilization of ketones versus glucose as the primary source of energy.
Yeah. Okay. I think, maybe the body tries to be as effective and as intelligent as possible. And I think that just utilizing fat for 5 days is not practical to think that the body would do that. I think the body mixes it up to kind of keep everything, as effective or as high level.
And as you're talking, that led me to a realization about the brain always needs some glucose for energy. Even if you can use 60 to 70% of
ketones
from the brain through ketones, it still has a demand for glucose. And so no matter what, your brain is going to pull for glucose, and where that glucose comes from, at some point, it may require muscle tissue to be oxidized for energy.
Okay.
But what that point is a tough one.
Yeah, definitely. But I just wanted to know if you felt that there was, something that you couldn't fast for forever or whatever it is.
It's clear that, at some point there's a shift that where that free mass is being broken down. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just an anecdotal kind of question. I don't have that sensation of hunger. And haven't had it for, I want to say, I don't know, like 2 years. So when I eat, I literally eat because I know that I have to eat. So I'm in that state. But however, I also don't go further than 24-hour fasting. I feel like maybe if I go a little bit farther than that, I might feel that sensation. But I don't feel that feeling. Is that is my body just adjusting to intermittent fasting, or like what would you say would be the reasons why I literally do not feel hunger? I haven't felt hunger.
Pretty fascinating that you've adapted to that level where you feel good energy, it seems to me, and so you're not tired or weak or any of those factors, but you also don't feel hungry. And so I think that it sounds like you've just adapted to the point where you become more efficient at using ketones for energy. And as we talked about earlier, ketones can help control hunger levels and allow you to be able to function for long periods of time. And as we talked about in our article, that was an advantage, evolutionarily speaking, to be able to go for 24, 48 hours without food, because food was not always just plentiful. And if we weren't able to do that, we as a species would probably not be here today. And so the fact that you don't feel hunger is interesting, though. I probably would agree at some point you would probably start to feel hunger. Personally, I don't really feel hunger until usually around 2 p.m. nowadays. It's kind of shifts on the day, and there's a lot of factors that can play a role in terms of how much exercise I've done. But I understand what you're referring to, of getting into that state where you just don't really feel hungry, but you haven't eaten. It's an interesting state to be.
And over the years, I went through tiers where like you said, I didn't feel hunger until the time that I'm supposed to eat. And then it, like another year later, it went to even the time that I'm supposed to eat, I don't feel hunger even then. But I also don't feel full either. Like I don't feel like I can't eat. I feel like I can eat. I just don't feel like I have the craving to eat. So, and I think, like you said, I think it's a fat adaptation kind of system that's happening. But
I think so.
I do want to talk, just if you could give me a brief, because I'm super curious about this, your debate that you had. There's not much information out there in terms of that debate. And so I just want like maybe a brief overview of the debate. If you can give me like a little summarization of what happened within that debate, and what was the premise? I know it was intermittent fasting, but what was the actual premise between it? Like, was it that intermittent fasting is not effective, or for fat loss, or for weight loss, or for adherence? And and then like just a quick summarization, and then we'll go ahead and end the interview. But just want to know what that debate was, because I'm just extremely curious about it.
Sure. So about a week and a half ago, I was in a debate at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, a huge conference and great conference. And the debate was really a format to kind of just get the conversation going about what's the state of science here related to intermittent fasting. And the questions, there was 2 questions that were provided. One was related to weight management potential and fat loss potential, which we've talked a good bit about. And then the other was related to metabolic disease conditions and what evidence is out there that intermittent fasting could be a helpful approach for individuals with type 2 diabetes. And I was the pro intermittent fasting as having large potential for, both producing beneficial changes in body composition and also metabolic disease conditions. And the other person was more of the skeptic and saying, at this point in time, we don't have enough research to make strong conclusions. And at the end of the day, we were probably meeting close to the middle, because I would say that there is research out there, which I've referenced a couple times, related to 15 clinical trials now on changes in body composition following intermittent fasting, 5 of which were time-restricted feeding, 10 of which were the alternate day fasting. And in, I think, either 13 or 14 of the 15, you're seeing significant fat loss. And again, with the time-restricted feeding, you don't see the loss of fat-free mass. With the alternate day fasting, you see a little bit more loss of fat-free mass, but in all 10 of those trials, you saw significant fat loss. So I use that as the primary evidence to support my position that, this is an approach that really has been studied with clinical trials. We just haven't done the longer term clinical trials yet. And then the second question was related to metabolic disease conditions and diabetes. And there we don't have as strong of evidence from clinical trials. We do have case studies that have shown, reversal of diabetes and in the sense of no longer type 2 diabetes, not type 1, in the sense of no longer needing insulin level in insulin dependent conditions, but that's only in very few individuals that, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a clinical trial that have randomly assigned individuals to this type of eating pattern to see what effects it has. But there are findings from preclinical trials, which I referenced, that did suggest that every other day eating pattern in animals can really improve metabolic function. And so it was a nice, healthy, just discussion and enjoyable debate. Yeah. Which I understand got some representation on Twitter after.
Yeah, it did. Which I was jumping right on that.
Yeah. And, and just to kind of, a final point is that I do believe that we need a lot more research in the area of what effects intermittent fasting has on disease conditions before we go widely promoting it for any metabolic disease. And so right now the evidence is just not there for anybody to responsibly say this will work for you. But there is promising evidence to suggest it would.
Yeah. And the way I use my my YouTube channel, it's basically an intermittent fasting channel since its inception. But I view myself as an aggregator of information. So what I do is I look at a lot of studies and I break them down in an easy way for anyone to consume them. Because, a lot of studies have a lot of terminology and a lot of abbreviations and a lot of different things like N equals and, things like that, p-value. So I like to break them down and make them kind of put them in layman's term for my audience to view. But I definitely never make any claims. What I do is if there's a health study that happened and had a result, I would present it. And then I'll also mention limitations and stuff to that nature. But it is very interesting to see that intermittent fasting does have all of these significant events that happen within the body in terms of fat loss, in terms of health and stuff like that. So it was great having you on here for this interview. I appreciate it so much. You were very gracious to answer my email and do this with me. And do you have maybe any ways for my audience to be able to get more information from you by any chance?
Thanks for asking. I know it was a pleasure to talk with you. At some point, I'll have a website up in the near future where, I'll put a lot more information and blogs about intermittent fasting up with my name on it, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, anybody can email me at my UFL address if they have questions, and you can.
And I'll link that down below.
Yeah, sure. But my goal is to provide more information for the world about this as well.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thank you, Dr. Stephen Anton. It was awesome having you here for the IF Warriors to see, and IF stands for intermittent fasting. It was really good. It was very insightful, actually. I was happy to get your perspective on these things. There was a few questions that I wanted kind of to see what your answer would be, and it was very interesting to see what you had to say about that. So I appreciate it. This will end the interview, and I want to stay in contact with you and be able to, if you have any new developments or anything like that, definitely, you can shoot me an email anytime. I really would appreciate that. So once again, thank you, and have a great, awesome day, week.
You too. Okay.
Bye.